The cold shock of the water was a familiar enemy. Ethan Hayes moved through it with a grim efficiency, his arms cutting through the dark surface of Blackwood Lake, his focus narrowed to a single point, the thrashing shape a dozen yards ahead. He'd heard the scream from the shore, a sharp, terrified sound that had sliced through the quiet afternoon he was sharing with his daughter. One moment, he was watching 7-year-old Rosie sketch the ancient pines in her notebook, the next, he was kicking off his worn boots and hitting the water. He didn't think. He just moved. The upturned canoe bobbed uselessly nearby, a sleek, expensive thing that had no business being out in the sudden chop. He reached the woman just as her strength gave out, her head slipping beneath the waves. He grabbed a fistful of her soaked blazer, hauling her back to the surface. She sputtered, coughing up water, her eyes wide with a terror that was quickly fading into unconsciousness. He hooked an arm under her chin, keeping her airway clear, and began the slow, burning swim back to shore. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, but even in the panicked haze, he felt a strange, unsettling flicker of recognition. It was a ghost of a memory, too distant to grasp. He dismissed it. Right now, she was just a life he had to save. Back on the rocky bank, he laid her down, immediately starting chest compressions, his movements sure and steady from a first aid course he'd taken years ago. Rosie stood back, her small face a mask of worry, clutching her drawing pad to her chest. "Is she okay, Daddy?" "She will be," Ethan promised, not for the woman, but for his daughter. He didn't look at the woman's face again until the paramedics arrived, their sirens wailing as they navigated the winding lakeside road. Only then, as they loaded her onto a stretcher, did he allow himself a proper look. Her features were sharp and elegant, framed by dark, wet hair plastered to her skin. She looked powerful, even helpless like this. A stranger. He was sure of it. He pulled his soaked shirt tighter around himself, shivering not just from the cold, but from the sudden, sharp memory of another body of water, another loss he could not prevent. He pushed it down, turning to wrap a strong arm around his daughter. The immediate danger was over. The echoes, however, were just beginning. Back in the warmth of their small, 2-room cabin, the scent of pine and drying laundry filled the air. Ethan wrapped Rosie in her favorite fuzzy blanket, a faded yellow one covered in smiling cartoon suns. He made her hot chocolate, his hands still trembling slightly as he stirred the milk. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. His job as a groundskeeper for the Blackwood Lake Resort paid just enough to keep their small world turning, but it demanded a physical toll. Today had added an emotional one. He watched Rosie carefully draw a picture of a man pulling a woman from a lake, her crayon hero a stick figure with a determined frown just like his. He managed a weak smile. He was her hero, and that was the only title that ever mattered. The woman from the lake, he'd learned from the frantic resort manager, was Amelia Vance, the CEO of Vance Innovations. She was the architect of a potential hostile takeover of the entire resort, a corporate titan whose presence had been a source of anxious gossip among the staff for weeks. And he, the man who mowed the lawns and fixed the leaky faucets, had just pulled her from a watery grave. The irony was a bitter pill. He tucked Rosie into her small bed, kissing her forehead. "You were very brave today, sweet pea," he whispered. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and serious. "You were braver, Daddy." "You're always the bravest." He sat by her side until her breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep. In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of his own past, Ethan felt the weight of it all. He was just a single father, trying to build a safe harbor for his daughter, a man defined by a loss he could never outrun. His wife, Sarah, had loved the water. The crash that took her had happened on a rain-slicked road beside a river. For years, he'd avoided so much as looking at a lake. Coming here had been a test, a way to prove he wouldn't let fear own him or his daughter. Today, the water had tested him again, and he had won. But as he looked out the window at the moonlit lake, he wondered what it had truly cost him. Amelia Vance awoke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. Her first sensation was a raw, aching in her chest. Her second was the sight of Richard, her fiancé, pacing at the foot of her hospital bed, his phone pressed to his ear. He wasn't looking at her, he was dictating a press release. "Ms. Vance is in stable condition," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "She expresses her profound gratitude to the resort staff for their swift action." We anticipate a full recovery and a continuation of our business discussions in the coming days. He finally noticed her eyes were open and ended the call with a curt dismissal. Amelia, thank God, he said, his relief sounding more like annoyance at a disrupted schedule. You had us all worried. The board is in a panic. She tried to speak, but her throat was sandpaper. She remembered the canoe tipping, the shocking cold, the feeling of her lungs screaming for air. Then, a strong arm, a sense of being pulled upward. The man, she rasped. Who saved me? Some groundskeeper, Richard said dismissively, waving a hand. We'll send him a check. A generous one. It's a good PR angle, actually. Corporate chief saved by the common man. We can spin this. Amelia closed her eyes. The hollowness she so often felt in her life, the one she filled with 16-hour workdays and ruthless acquisitions, felt like a cavern inside her now. Richard saw a PR angle. She had almost died. A few days later, against Richard's strenuous objections, she insisted on thanking the men in person. Ethan Hayes stood on the porch of his rustic cabin, his posture straight, his hands clean but his nails permanently rimmed with the earth he worked. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear and direct. Ma'am, he said with a simple nod. I'm glad to see you're all right. I wanted to thank you, Amelia said, feeling strangely formal. You saved my life. I'd like to offer you a reward. Ethan shook his head before she could even name a figure. No, thank you. I just did what anyone would have. He looked past her, his gaze softening as Rosie peeked out from behind the door. My daughter was there. I'd want someone to do the same for me if she were in trouble. His quiet dignity was a wall she couldn't breach with money. It was unnerving. It was compelling. She saw the worn soles of his boots, the faint patch on the elbow of his jacket, and understood that he needed the money. His refusal wasn't pride, it was principle. And in her world, principle was a commodity rarer than gold. Richard was furious. He saw Ethan's refusal not as a mark of character, but as an insult, a strategic play he couldn't comprehend. Everyone has a price, he seethed in the privacy of their luxury suite. This man is either a fool or he's trying to manipulate you for something bigger. A lawsuit, maybe. Amelia ignored him. She found herself drawn to the quieter parts of the resort, near the staff cabins. From a distance, she watched Ethan and Rosie. She saw him patiently teaching his daughter how to skip stones across the lake's calm surface. She saw them tending a small vegetable garden behind their cabin, their heads bent close together in shared concentration. There was a simple, unvarnished love between them that felt more real than anything in her own life. Her engagement to Richard was a strategic alliance, a merger of two powerful families to consolidate their hold on the market. It was a business decision, not a matter of the heart. Her heart was a locked room she hadn't visited in years. As she watched Ethan, fragments of another time began to surface, hazy and indistinct. The scent of pine needles baking in the sun. The feel of a worn denim jacket. The sound of a pencil scratching against paper. She remembered a summer spent here at this very lake, long before the resort was built, when her family had rented a small cottage. She had been a teenager, all awkward limbs and big dreams. And there had been a boy. A local boy with quiet eyes and a gentle smile, who knew the name of every tree and every constellation in the night sky. She couldn't recall his face clearly, but she remembered the feeling of safety, of being seen for who she was, not who she was supposed to become. Richard's voice, sharp and demanding, would inevitably pull her back to the present. He wanted to finalize the takeover, to crush the small, family-owned resort under the heel of their corporate giant. But Amelia found herself hesitating. The place held a whisper of a memory, a ghost of a girl she used to be. And the groundskeeper, the quiet man with the kind eyes, felt like a part of that forgotten world. The moment of clarity came on a crisp autumn afternoon. Amelia had walked down to the shoreline, needing to escape the suffocating pressure of another conference call with her board. She passed Ethan's cabin and saw the door was slightly ajar. Pinned to the old wooden frame by a magnet was a child's drawing. It was a picture of a tall, slender lighthouse standing on a rocky cliff, waves crashing at its base. The crayon strokes were clumsy but heartfelt. But it wasn't the drawing itself that made Amelia stop, her breath catching in her throat. It was the subject. The Blackwood Point Lighthouse, which had been decommissioned and torn down 15 years ago. A tourist would never know it had existed. Only a local, someone with deep roots, would remember it. The image slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. A memory, sharp and vivid this time, a teenage boy sitting beside her on a sun-warmed dock, a worn sketchbook open on his lap. He was drawing that exact lighthouse, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had given her the drawing as a keepsake on the last day of that summer. A promise to remember. She'd kept it for years, until it was lost in one of her family's many moves. Eth, she whispered, the nickname tasting foreign on her tongue after 2 decades. His name was Eth. She turned, her heart hammering against her ribs, and saw Ethan coming around the side of the cabin, carrying a small basket of late-season tomatoes. He stopped when he saw her staring at the drawing, a question in his eyes. She took a hesitant step forward. "The lighthouse," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I remember someone who used to draw that lighthouse." His gaze sharpened, a flicker of disbelief warring with a dawning recognition. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the expensive clothes and the air of command. He saw the shape of her eyes, the curve of her smile, the things that time hadn't changed. "Amy," he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. Amy Preston. Amelia Vance, the titan of industry, felt the carefully constructed walls around her heart crumble to dust. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "It's me, Eth," she said softly. "It's me." The 20 years that had separated them dissolved in an instant, leaving only the boy and girl who had shared a single, perfect summer by the lake. They sat on the small porch of his cabin as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was filled with the weight of unspoken years. Rosie sat on the steps, humming quietly to herself as she organized a collection of smooth, gray stones, occasionally glancing at the 2 adults with a child's placid curiosity. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice low. "Your family just left. One day your cottage was empty. No note, no goodbye." Amelia looked down at her hands, the hands that signed multi-million-dollar deals, now twisting in her lap like a nervous teenager's. "My father got a promotion. A big one. We moved to London. It was all so fast. He said there wasn't time for goodbyes. He said teenage summer romances were foolish distractions." The bitterness in her voice was ancient. "I wrote to you," she added quietly. 4 months. But the letters all came back." Ethan nodded slowly. "My family moved after my dad lost his job at the mill. We were only a few towns over, but I guess the letters never found me." They filled in the broad strokes of the intervening decades. His marriage to his high school sweetheart, Sarah. Their shared dream of a simple life. The devastating car accident that had made him a widower and a single father. He spoke of his grief with a quiet, unadorned honesty that made her own carefully curated loneliness feel cheap and theatrical. She told him of her relentless climb up the corporate ladder, the pressure from her father to be tougher, smarter, more ruthless than any man. She spoke of her engagement to Richard as if describing a merger prospectus, all logic and no heart. "He doesn't see me," she confessed, the words tasting like freedom. "He sees a brand. An asset." Ethan just listened, his presence a steady anchor in the turbulent sea of her life. When she was done, he simply said, "I'm sorry you had to go through that alone." In that moment, she felt more seen than she had in 20 years. The connection between them, buried for so long, was not only rekindled, it was burning brighter than ever before. Richard was not a man who tolerated complications, and Amelia's sudden, intense interest in a lowly groundskeeper was a complication of the highest order. He saw the long talks on the cabin porch, the easy laughter that passed between her and the little girl. He saw the way Amelia's guard was down, a vulnerability he considered a liability. This wasn't part of the plan. The resort was meant to be another notch on their corporate belt, not a place for his fiancée to have an emotional breakdown. He decided to eliminate the problem. His investigators were ruthlessly efficient. They dug into every corner of Ethan Hayes' life. They found very little. The man was infuriatingly clean. But they did find one thing, a series of late payments on his deceased wife's medical bills from years ago, a debt that had eventually been settled but had temporarily damaged his credit. It was thin, but Richard was an expert at spinning thin threads into thick ropes. He arranged his confrontation for maximum impact, catching Ethan as he was loading supplies near the main lodge, with several staff members and guests milling about. Amelia was just walking out of a meeting. "Mr. Hayes," Richard began, his voice carrying with practiced authority. We've been doing a background check on all staff, for security purposes, you understand. Ethan straightened up, his expression wary. And I have to say, we've found some concerning financial instabilities in your past. A man in that kind of desperate situation. Well, it makes one wonder about his motives. A staged accident, a heroic rescue of a wealthy CEO. It's a classic setup for a big payday. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. A few onlookers stared, their expressions shifting from curiosity to suspicion. You think I tried to hurt her? Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I think you're an opportunist, Richard sneered. And a threat. I'm recommending your immediate termination to the resort manager. People like you don't belong here. He glanced at Amelia, expecting her to look horrified, to shrink back to his side. He had just saved her, after all, from a grifter. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Ethan, and her eyes were blazing with a fire he had never seen before. That's enough, Richard. Amelia's voice was cold steel. She walked forward, deliberately placing herself between Richard and Ethan, a human shield of defiance. Every eye was on them. You know nothing about this man. You know nothing about character, or integrity, or courage. She turned to face Richard, her expression one of utter contempt. This man, this opportunist, dove into a freezing lake to save my life without a moment's hesitation. He asked for nothing in return. Meanwhile, you stood in my hospital room crafting a press release before you even asked how I was. Richard's face paled, a flush of angry red creeping up his neck. Amelia, this is hardly the time or place. This is the perfect time and place. She cut him off, her voice ringing with clarity. For 20 years, I have lived the life my father and you mapped out for me. I have made decisions based on strategy, on profit margins, on what made for good business. I am done. She held up her hand, twisting the obscenely large diamond from her finger. She didn't throw it. She simply held it out to him. We are finished, Richard. The engagement is over. The business partnership is over. I want you off this property within the hour. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Richard stood, speechless, the ring in his outstretched hand. The resort manager, an older man named George who had known Ethan for years, stepped forward. Mr. Hayes is the most dependable man I have, he said firmly, looking directly at Richard. He's honest, and he's good. If he goes, half my staff goes with him. Another groundskeeper nodded in agreement, then a woman from the kitchen staff. The small community closed ranks around one of their own. Richard, utterly defeated and publicly humiliated, finally snatched the ring and stalked away without another word. Amelia turned to Ethan, her fiery anger softening into a vulnerable plea. I'm so sorry, she whispered. He simply shook his head, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. You didn't have to do that. Yes, she said, her gaze unwavering. I did. For the first time. She wasn't Amelia Vance, CEO. She was just Amy, and she was finally fighting for something that mattered. In the quiet aftermath, the world seemed to reset itself. Amelia made a series of calls, her voice calm and decisive. She informed her board that she was withdrawing the offer to acquire the Blackwood Lake Resort. The news was met with shock and confusion, but her tone left no room for argument. Her next call was to George, the resort manager. She didn't want to buy the resort to gut it. She wanted to invest in it, to preserve the very character that Richard had tried to extinguish. She proposed a partnership, a fund to renovate the aging infrastructure, improve staff wages, and ensure the place remained a sanctuary, not a corporate asset. And she had a condition. I want Ethan Hayes to oversee the project, she stated. He knows this place, he loves it, and he has the integrity to see it done right. Later that evening, she found Ethan by the water's edge, skipping stones with Rosie. She explained the plan, the offer. It wasn't charity, it was a promotion, a position of trust he had more than earned. He was quiet for a long time, watching the ripples spread across the lake's glassy surface. Why? He finally asked. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. And because that summer meant something to me, Eth. I buried it for a long time, but it was always there. You were always there. She took a deep breath, the confession hanging between them in the cool night air. When I was in that water, I wasn't thinking about stock prices or board meetings. I was thinking that I had lived a very full life, but I hadn't really lived at all. He stepped closer, his presence warm and solid. "I never forgot you, Amy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I looked for you in every crowd for years. Seeing you with Rosie. It feels like coming home." He reached out, his calloused hand gently taking hers. It felt like no time had passed at all. The lake that had nearly taken her life had, in the end, given it back to her, along with the one person she thought she had lost forever. The future was no longer a strategic plan, but an open, sunlit path. 6 months later, the Blackwood Lake Resort was alive with a new energy. The main lodge sported a new roof and a fresh coat of paint. The staff, secure in their jobs and paid a living wage, moved with a lighter step. Ethan, now the project and operations manager, walked the grounds with a quiet confidence that had always been there, but was now recognized by all. He was a natural leader, his kindness fostering loyalty and his hard work inspiring respect. Amelia had found a new rhythm. She hadn't abandoned her company, but she had transformed it. She delegated more, empowering her team, and worked remotely from a newly built, sustainable office near the resort 3 days a week. She had traded a corner office overlooking a city of steel for a window that looked out onto pine trees and shimmering water. She hadn't lost her power, she had redefined it. On a perfect late spring afternoon, the three of them took a canoe out onto the lake. The water was calm, a perfect mirror of the bright blue sky. Rosie sat between them, her head resting back against Amelia's knees, trailing her small hand in the cool water, her laughter echoing in the quiet air. Ethan paddled with a slow, steady stroke, his eyes fixed on Amelia. The guarded, powerful CEO was gone, replaced by a woman whose smile reached her eyes, whose laughter was free and genuine. He had not just saved her from the lake, they had saved each other from the lives they had been trapped in. Amelia met his gaze, her heart full. This was real. The quiet moments, the shared smiles, the warmth of a child leaning against her. This was the success she had unknowingly chased her entire life. It wasn't found in a boardroom or on a stock ticker, it was here, in a simple canoe on a quiet lake, with a man who had seen her at her worst and loved her anyway. They had found their way back to each other across a chasm of 20 years. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the water, they knew their journey was just beginning. How often does life give you a second chance at a first love? And what do you do when you realize the one you had to save is also the one who will end up saving you?